Let's talk about Mark chapter 12. This is a climactic moment. Things have been ramping up, the tension has been mounting, and recall last week we looked at Jesus coming into the temple with this show of authority and force, overturning the money changers, stopping the daily sacrifice. This is a really important event. Jesus is outing himself as the true king of Israel, God's Messiah, the one who has authority over the temple itself. This is more than just stopping a normal church service. This had so many deep connotations to it. And so naturally people are wondering, who is this guy? How does he dare have the audacity to claim that kind of authority? And so chapter 12 has this series of escalating moments. First, Jesus launches into this parable. It's a different sort of parable than all the rest that we've seen. First half of Mark, tons of parables, and it seems the point of those parables was to keep people on the outside from getting it too quickly. They had to kind of dig a little deeper, and if they really wanted to figure out what Jesus was about, they had to start following him and become his disciple and ask more questions. But those on the outside, the Pharisees, the opposition, they weren't going to quite understand what Jesus was up to. But then Jesus in chapter 12 launches into a parable about this vineyard and the workers, and it's all about Israel and how God is coming to bring judgment upon Israel's leaders. And it actually ends with the Pharisees fully understanding what Jesus is saying, and they want to kill him because of it. So it's just a different sort. The tension is mounting, and now for the first time Jesus is actively proclaiming who he is and making people really mad about it. There's a series of tests that they start launching at him, which makes sense. He's claiming to be somebody. He's claiming to be the king who can overturn the temple. And so they start to ask him, what about this? What about this? What about this? A few famous ones. These are all just still background for our text for today. But they ask him about paying taxes to Caesar. And so they're pitting Jesus against Caesar. Again, thinking of our theme of Jesus becoming king, bringing a kingdom, it makes sense then why this is one of the tests that they throw at him. Is this a king who's going to try to rise up, pick up the sword, and fight with Caesar or not? Because to not pay taxes would have been to declare open rebellion. And so they're trying to get Jesus to pick a side already. Jesus navigates it in genius fashion. He's able to say, look, whose inscription is on the coin? Well, it's Caesar's. So give to Caesar what is Caesar's. I don't need those little coins. But then he takes it a step further and says, but what's that inscription on the coin? On the coins of Caesar with his inscription on it, it said, Caesar, the Son of God. And so he then says, but you know what? Give to God what is God's. He actually separates. He says, yeah, Caesar can have his little coin, but he's not God. He's not all that important. And so he's navigating this world of tests, and he is a king, but he's not a king who's going to come and pick up the sword and fight against the empires of the world, and yet he's not going to give them full obedience and worship either. And so it's very unsettling. People don't quite know what to do with him. There's a couple more tests, and then he throws one out at them, which completely links him with the anointed one of David. He talks about Psalm 110 and so all of that. But then we're jumping in verse 38. In chapter 12, verse 38 into verse 13. And there's a moment where Jesus is bringing his judgment, a prophetic judgment against Jerusalem. A few things to notice in our text for today. Notice the repetition of the word widow. He starts by talking about the scribes and the leaders of Israel, whose one of their primary roles was to take care of the widow. He then goes into the temple and he sees a widow giving all that she has, which is a beautiful, amazing picture of faith, but it also is doing something in the wider context, because right out of that, the house of God that was supposed to take care of this widow is actually taking the last coin that she has, and the very next thing Jesus does is sit down and say, this whole thing, it's all going to be destroyed. So all of that is very intentional. So just as you're noticing that, maybe we'll start this week and just do a quick review of chapter 12 and say, what are all these tests mounting to? What is it revealing about who Jesus is, about his identity? And then as we get into the specifics of our text for today, chapter 12, 38 down into 13, verse 4, what is going on here, and how does Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple coincide with everything that's been happening up until now? In essence, last week, his stopping of the sacrifices was a prophetic enactment, a symbol of the destruction of the temple that he's about to proclaim is going to happen soon. And so Jesus is speaking around 30 AD. In just a short 40 years, that will actually happen. Rome will come, surround Jerusalem, and destroy the temple, or not one stone will be left upon another. Chapter 13 is a famous passage for people thinking about our own day and the end times and tribulation and all of that and what's going on there. There's a lot to pull into it. We're actually not going to spend time in this series in chapter 13 too much, but I would like to point out that whatever chapter 13 is, it's a response to the disciples' question in the first few verses. Jesus just predicted the downfall of the Jerusalem temple. The disciples then sit with Jesus on the Mount of Olives and say, "Tell us, teacher, when will these things happen?" And Jesus launches into what is now known as the Olivet Discourse. It seems that he's actually answering their question. He's saying, I'm going to give you an answer about when the destruction of the temple is going to happen. And he's giving them warnings and things to look out for because it's going to happen within their generation. And so you could go through that. There's a lot of images in chapter 13 about wars and violence and armies of Rome coming, and he actually warns his believers to flee Jerusalem. He says, that's not your fight. When you find that Rome is surrounding Jerusalem and the zealots of Israel are picking up the sword ready to fight, get out of there. And we actually know from church history that the early Christians did that. They left Jerusalem, and they did not fight. Jesus warned them, this is not your fight, get out of there. And sure enough, Rome came and no one left in Jerusalem was left alive, and the temple was destroyed, and the rest is history. So that's kind of maybe a lot to take in. We just did a quick run through of chapters 12 and 13, but spend some time in the section for this week in particular. On a personal level, again, it's a great picture of the faith of this woman, and even just the things, notice the things that Jesus notices versus the things the disciples are enamored with. What are they looking at? And how is that significant? Why is this repetition of widows coming right before Jesus predicts the downfall of Jerusalem? And what else is stirring your curiosity and your wonder from the text this week? Thanks, everyone.